special webinar series. As you know, it's more than a year that we have been doing these webinar series. The EGROW Foundation is a recently set up policy-oriented think tank in NCR region. We are located in Noida, very close to Delhi. And our aim and objective is to provide research-based policy advice to the government or anyone who is seeking advice from us. In the COVID period, we have done successfully many research-based webinars, basically looking at issues that are contemporary and are policy-oriented. It is in that context that today's webinar is being organized on inflation expectation. To chair the webinar today is our chairman, the founder chairman of EGROW Foundation, Dr. Virmani. Dr. Virmani is highly experienced in both policy making and research. He has been the principal advisor to the Planning Commission and then the chief economic advisor, Government of India. Virtually since 1990, he has been actively involved in all major economic reforms, be it the tax reforms, be it the custom duty reforms. He has been actively involved in it and he has been part of it. In the research work, Dr. Virmani again has a number of published articles in various journals, and he has 20 book chapters and written over 50 working papers in the areas of macroeconomics, growth and finance, tax reform, international trade and tariffs, international relations, and national security strategy. With this, I invite Dr. Virmani to chair the session and take the proceedings further.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have Professor Michael Weber from the Chicago Booth School of Business in the Chicago University. He has been an assistant professor since 2014 and an associate professor since 2018. So it's good to have you. He has also been a research affiliate at the CEPR and at the CES IFO Research Network. He is published in the leading journals, American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies, Journal of Political Economy, Review of Financial Studies, Journal of Financial Economics, etc. So, which is much more than I have published. Probably I published in maximum 2 of those journals. So we are very happy to have you. And with that, let me hand it over to you to start your talk.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words and for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be here and discuss my work, which is joined with Olli Corbion at Austin and Yuri Gortnichenko at UC Berkeley. And we want to discuss the interrelationship between perceived and realized inflation and how they affect the expectations of households in the US in normal times, but also in particular in the last couple of years during the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular using data from 2020 and 2021. It's like a little bit of motivating this line of work. When we started working on the paper, there was lots of discussion among colleagues, how should we think about the COVID-19 recession? Is it like more of a supply shock? Is it more of a demand shock? Or is it maybe a mixture of the two? And of course, policymakers were facing the very similar kind of challenge. But if you think about it, even in your daily lives as a household, you kind of had to think about very similar challenges because, when I went shopping in early April, let's say, and the toilet paper was out of stock in the supermarket, I had to figure out, is it due because maybe some of my neighbors kind of overreact and started stockpiling because they're super scared of how long it will last. And then we could say, well, maybe, might just wait a little bit and at some point, the shelf is restocked and it's no big deal. Instead, if it's potentially due to workers being concerned of their health or the health of family members and similar type of considerations, then actually this stock out might be actually longer lived. And so therefore, I might also be a little bit more worried. And so the way we want to kind of tackle this question is through the lens of the subjective expectations of households in the US, where we want to understand a little bit, are the expectations of households more consistent with the supply or demand side view of the recession? And then, also drill a little bit into like some heterogeneity results and what might help us understand the big spike in households inflation expectations that we observed as early of April of 2020. So like, the big increase in expectations, of course, ex ante would be consistent with the supply side view, contrary to, for example, the Federal Reserve that in June of 2020 was forecasting an inflation rate for 2021 of 1.6%, so substantially below their target. Households instead saw a big spike in inflation expectations, but at the same time, you also, as you'll see in a second, there was a substantial amount of disagreement across households during that time period. And this increase in disagreement, of course, might just reflect that even within households, there was some disagreement whether the shock is a supply or demand shock. Alternatively, it might just be that there's heterogeneity about the size of the shock. All kind of think that it's a supply shock, but some actually think it's worse than others, and that might potentially explain the dispersion in inflation expectations across households. And if it is the latter, then of course we might think that, what could potentially drive the different size of the shock people might actually perceive. It could be because people observe or purchase different shopping bundles, and through that observe different price signals, or people largely have similar bundles but actually tend to go shopping at different outlets, or use coupons, discounts, versus others don't use the coupons, and so that might potentially also lead to different price signals individuals observe. And so the way we actually want to study these questions is through a survey of US households. So since 2018, we've been running quarterly surveys on what is called the Nielsen Home Scan panel that I'll introduce in the next couple of slides. And so there per wave, we have about 25,000 households that, based on observables, are as representative of the US overall population as you can think. And then the nice feature of this panel is that we can, at the individual level, link their survey responses, so expectations for inflation and the unemployment and so on, to individual spending data in their non-durable consumption bundle. So therefore, we can then create at the individual level a measure of realized inflation, and then through the survey link it to the perceived and expected inflation rate of individuals, but then also enrich it with other kind of expectations, for example, for the unemployment rate. And then the joint study of these expectations and realized inflation allows us to shed some light on the perceived forces that drove the recession in the US. So what we show in the paper is that, if you look at basic goods people purchase frequently, like milk, beer, bread, and so on, they observed or witnessed a large increase in realized inflation in our April 2020 wave, which we had in the field between the 2nd and the 7th of April. So like right at the beginning, or widespread in beginning of COVID-19 in the US. And we show that even in realized inflation rates across households, there was a sharp increase in the US. But there's also like heterogeneity across certain observable characteristics, as we'll see in a bit, and this both the dispersion in the bundle that households purchase, but also differences in realized inflation rate within narrow categories helps us explain the large increase in realized inflation dispersion across households. And then we actually show that there's indeed a tight link between the increase at the individual level in their realized inflation and their inflation expectations. So what people observe in their daily life indeed kind of directly maps into individuals' inflation expectations. And this link is actually more pronounced for lower income and lower education households. And in general, this is also true before the pandemic, but we do see that households tend to have a supply side view of inflation, in the sense that high inflation expectations tend to go hand in hand with higher unemployment expectations. And that's actually a view that's actually shared across the whole population. It's very pervasive and common for US households. And then we also show that the dispersion in realized inflation to a large extent can explain the large increase in the dispersion in inflation expectations that we also noticed. So now let me, just motivate a little bit, so like why we might actually think that, the price of milk and things like that might matter predominantly for how individuals think about household inflation expectations. So this is from some earlier work we've been doing with Francesco Da Cunto and Ulrike Malmentier. And so like there's this long-standing puzzle in households inflation expectations that, on the one hand, everyone tends to have upward biased inflation expectations. This is data from the New York Fed survey of consumer expectations from between 2011 and 2018. Realized inflation on average was below 2%. Men expect an average inflation during that period of a bit more than 4%. But actually, women have a substantially higher upward bias. So the upward bias is about like twice as high as that of men. So like it looks like somehow there seem to be specific differences across men and women in the way they think about inflation. And so like that motivated us looking in our own survey, a little bit understanding the driving forces between what we call the gender difference or gap in inflation expectations. And here what you see is in a survey that we also ran on this Nielsen HomeScan panel. And the nice feature here is that we were surveying male and female household head from the same household. So typically, you have individuals from different households, and there, across households, many things, of course, differ. So here it's the first time that it's indeed like, within household, what is the difference in the female versus male household heads inflation expectations? And you see it's about 0.45 percentage points. That's the left panel. What we then do in the right panel, we just split our households into those where the male household head declares never to go grocery shopping at all versus households in which the male household head declares at least once in a while to go grocery shopping. And here what you see is like the gender gap kind of increases by 40% within what we call more traditional households, where women are solely responsible for grocery shopping versus actually they are not at all present. This gap among I don't know, liberal households where also the male head goes shopping. And the reason is because men in that sample on average also have higher inflation expectations. So it looks like somehow being exposed to volatile price changes in while grocery shopping somehow leads to an upward bias in inflation expectations. And of course, you can directly ask household, when you think about inflation, what are the most important sources of information that came to mind when forming inflation expectations? And here, actually, the predominant source when asking people, here we had all those different sources in randomized order. People could choose. And then the top 3 sources were recorded in the survey. The most important one had a score of 3. And here you see like predominantly the most important one on average was actually people's own shopping experiences when thinking about households' inflation expectations. So also like from joint work with Francesco and Ulrike and a former PhD student of mine, Juan Ospina, who's now the head of research at the Colombian Central Bank. And then what we did in this paper from last year, we actually calculate at the individual level measures of realized inflation over the previous 12 months. So the way to reach this figure here, one, this is like the part of the survey population. So this was based on 50,000 households that had the lowest realized inflation over the previous 12 months versus 8. Those are the households with the highest realized inflation over the past 12 months. And then we just here plot simply, what do you on average think will happen to inflation going forward for over the next 12 months? And here you see like, there's a monotonic relationship that people that have the highest realized inflation have the highest inflation expectations. So it looks like, again, like, a variation in realized inflation in the non-durable consumption bundle of households tends to be associated with the way people think about inflation expectations. Of course, you could think, well, maybe actually those that had high past realized inflation, the reason why they expect high overall inflation for the overall economy, this is the elicited CPI inflation, is because also their realized inflation is still high going forward. But we actually, in fact, show like, past realized inflation in the non-durable consumption bundle for individual households is pretty much not predictive of future realized inflation at the household level, just because like grocery price changes are so highly mean reverting. which is of course the reason why they are stripped off when central banks look at core inflation, because they don't have really predictive power for future realized inflation. Nevertheless, households tend to focus exactly on these type of prices. And that's in fact also, what you see when you just ask them, are there any specific goods that come to mind when thinking about inflation, or what do you think are the drivers of inflation? And so like, ordinary people, they tend to think about the price of milk, the price of gas, bread, eggs, and so on. Some interesting also gender differences in the sense that men think more about gas, women, let's say, more about milk. This is a survey in the US. If it was run in Germany, I guess like more people would have mentioned the price of beer, for example. But, just to give an idea that people tend to think about very specific items and their prices when thinking about future inflationary pressures, which of course also means like, from what are the policy implications of that? Like, those are typically all the price changes that we tend to ignore when thinking about future inflationary pressures, but instead households tend to exactly focus on these to form inflation expectations. That's the first one, which of course then, concern could be that central banks might actually lose the trust households have in them, because like households think that central banks actually don't care about the things they can tend to care about. But at the same time, also, if you have followed the discussion in the US economy last summer, like, people were saying like, inflation, we don't have to worry. It's coming from price changes in narrow categories, rental car prices and things like that. If those are very salient prices for households, and households tend to focus, exactly on those narrow categories that observed or witnessed an initial inflationary impulse, then it can actually occur that inflation expectations for overall inflation of households immediately spike up. And that through that mechanism, then potentially, as we discussed a little bit before we started the webinar, potentially like wage price spirals, because households actually then bargain for higher wages. We might indeed also see overall inflation catching up, even though initially we only saw an initial impulse in a narrow category. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit more in detail what we do in the current paper. And of course, our crucial ingredient is this Nielsen home scan panel that I alluded to previously. Think about it like you have 80,000 households, and all households in this panel, they have an optical scanner at home, and then all goods they purchase in their daily lives that has a barcode. So largely, grocery items, smaller durables and pharmaceutical items, they would actually then, once they go home with the shopping, they would scan those goods, and then Nielsen would directly also record the prices. So then you observe for these households at the daily frequency, what did they purchase? Where did they purchase it? Did they purchase it on sale, or did they use a coupon, and so on? From Nielsen, then we already have a rich set of demographics like age, income, marital status, number of kids, education, the job situation, and things like that. And one thing to make sure, because like we'll need that later on to measure realized inflation, that what actually households report in this panel is accurate. So Nielsen actually does a pretty decent job in terms of incentivizing households. Like for each item you scan, you get like think about like an airline mile, so to speak. And so then with like your points you collected, you then can actually kind of get additional goodies from a Nielsen specific award catalog. At some point, so like Nielsen has been running like small scale surveys on a monthly basis. Was that question? Unfortunately, I couldn't.
Hello, if somebody's got unmuted, please mute. You're disturbing the speaker.
And so like, Nielsen runs so smaller ad hoc surveys, so mainly like, to gather kind of data for Coca-Cola or let's say Pepsi, those like, retail, the producers of consumer goods that would actually kind of pay Nielsen to get some idea of consumer demand. And at some point in 2015, we figured out that actually US researcher can also field ad hoc customized surveys on that panel. And since 2018, Q1, we've actually been running waves on that panel, typically with different focus. In one wave, you want to understand the effect of fiscal spending on inflation expectations, and another one of monetary policy communication. Oftentimes, we do that through information provision experiments and randomized controlled trials. And so, but consistently throughout the survey, we've always elicited perceived inflation. What do you think was inflation over the last 12 months, but also expected inflation over the next 12 months, always specifying that we ask for overall inflation that is typically measured through the change in the consumer price index by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, one nice feature of this Nielsen panel, of course, is the fact that it's just so much larger in magnitude. So like if you would compare our sample size with the Michigan Survey of Consumer or the New York Fed Survey of Consumer Expectations, like that are oftentimes used for research, like we have 25,000 respondents per wave versus 500 or 1,500. So like we can really drill into like heterogeneity across individuals, which is not possible, of course, like in these other surveys. And then, just in terms of giving you an idea, like typically we have a response rate of about 25%. And as we saw earlier, sometimes multiple respondents from the same household. Of course, the key ingredient for the paper today is like a measure of realized inflation at the household level. And so as we mentioned earlier, like when I talk about realized inflation, I mean among goods we observe in the Nielsen panel. So think about largely grocery items and pharmaceutical items. And then to actually construct realized inflation, we first calculate at the individual module level. And so a module in this Nielsen panel, you can think about like, breakfast bars, baking soda, and so on. So pretty narrow categories of consumption goods, the effective price paid by a given household in a given quarter. And the effective price, just think about it like how much did a household spend in that or on that module in a quarter divided by the total volume. So like, I spend $100 on milk divided by the gallons I purchased. And then realized inflation at the module level would just simply be, the log price change from quarter to quarter. Now, the reason why we actually calculate effective prices, different from, for example, like, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics also would be doing, rather than like, a price change at an individual good or UPC level, because like by doing calculating effective prices, we do allow for substitution across like, specific types of milk or volumes of milk, but also like across different stores, which of course, during a pandemic especially is important. And then realized inflation at the individual household level is just simply, add up across individual modules, the effective log price changes weighted by the expenditure share at an individual household level. And the way we look at expenditure shares is like, it's again the average between the current quarter and the previous quarter. So effectively, we again allow for some substitution from one quarter to another, because it was also like quite important during the pandemic. Okay, so like the way we then elicit inflation expectations, that's by directly asking households about inflation, similar to what the New York Fed is doing. You might be familiar with the way the Michigan Survey, for example, elicits inflation expectations by asking about prices of things we purchase, where people are concerned that you directly prompt them to think about groceries. So here instead we say like, in the next couple of questions, we want to have your opinion on overall inflation, which is typically measured through the change in the consumer price index. And then we first ask them, what do you think was inflation over the past 12 months? We call that the perception of inflation. And then the expectation of future inflation we elicit in two ways, one via a point estimate, and the second one via full probability distribution. So here you can think this is what the New York Fed is doing. If pre-specified bins starting from -12 to +12%, and then households have to allocate probability mass that has to add up to 100 before they can actually continue in the survey. And then in addition, we also have the perception of current and expectations of future unemployment. So now let me first show you a little bit, some measures of realized inflation across different observable characteristics. So like, while there's a nice paper by Kaplan and Sam Schulhofer-Wohl, they show there's lots of dispersion, but very little can explain it in normal times, in the sense like very little variation is systematically associated with sociodemographics of households. And so we kind of want to revisit that during the pandemic, and I actually want to study realized inflation by race, income categories, and education levels. And what you see here is now we start in 2018 until Q1 of 2021. Indeed, like, if you look by race before the pandemic, very little systematic association in terms of realized inflation. This is quarter to quarter inflation. So like, if you want to look at annualized numbers, just actually multiply it by 4. Instead, actually, what you then see at the onset of the pandemic, you see that, realized inflation spikes up, but the increase is substantially larger for Black survey participants compared to white, Asian, or Hispanic survey participants. So like, realized inflation is about 2 percentage points higher for Black relative to other survey participants. So like in normal times, very little systematic difference, but then at the onset of the pandemic, realized inflation spiking up substantially more for Blacks versus others. You see a similar pattern by income, in normal times, very little systematic variation by income categories. In yellow, those making more than 100K. In blue, well, less than $30,000 per year. But then again, like at the onset of the pandemic, realized inflation spiking up, but it's spiking up by about actually 4 percentage points more annualized for low relative to high income households in the Nielsen panel. And then, we see a similar pattern also by education, in the sense that before the pandemic, very little systematic association. And then, the least educated seeing a higher realized inflation rate relative to the highest educated survey participants on average. And so now what we want to do is try to understand what actually helps us understand this increase in realized inflation, but also dispersion across household characteristics. And so the first thing we want to understand is, is this the increase in dispersion driven by, differences in expenditure shares across different categories and households, or is it because, like, conditional on having the same consumption bundle, people differ in the prices they pay for kind of similar items? And so here what you see, and this is, just one first piece of evidence. So here, if you look at the distribution of realized prices or realized inflation in the cross section, you see, like, if you compare the P5 versus the P95, so the percentiles of the realized inflation distribution, there's a noticeable kind of opening up during the pandemic. So it looks like, there's an increase in the dispersion in realized inflation across categories in this Nielsen panel. Here you can, of course, then also zoom in into individual goods. So here, we have just realized inflation for some frequently purchased goods. So, if you look at the price of eggs, cereals, and pasta, this is still this is now annualized. You see, like, here pretty sizable realized inflation rates as high as for the individual goods of more than 12%, versus like other goods like, candy, gum, and tea, low realized inflation, but some even actually seeing like price decreases at the onset of the pandemic. So like, if people now differ in the expenditure shares for pasta, cereal, and these type of things, of course, this then directly maps into differences in realized inflation. Instead, if you zoom in and say, like, within product module, what is the dispersion across households? There's certainly lots of dispersion in terms of like the prices individuals pay, because some go shopping, let's say, at Whole Foods, which is a more higher price store, others a Trader Joe's or Aldi, lower price stores, some use coupons, others don't. But you don't really see at the onset of the pandemic a big increase in that with across household within product module dispersion, which makes this actually a less likely explanation for the sharp increase in realized inflation dispersion. So now after we actually saw that realized inflation went up, we now want to understand whether this increase in realized inflation can actually indeed shape inflation expectations through the effect on inflation perceptions. And if you now, if you would go back to the Lucas Islands model, in the second sentence of the introduction, Lucas actually writes in 72 that people would use like the signal use the price on their island as a signal for the overall price. So like it might indeed be the case, and this is like a literal interpretation of Lucas, that people, when they go shopping, they see price signals and actually would use those to form overall inflation expectations. As we saw at the very beginning, this is indeed what happens in normal times, in the sense that heterogeneity in realized inflation can shape individuals' inflation expectations. And we now want to understand whether also during the pandemic, this is to some extent what was going on, whether this the big increase in the dispersion in realized inflation we just saw in the previous slides also partially transmits into dispersion in inflation expectations. So here, the first thing we actually want to look at is just to understand how inflation expectations moved during across the individual survey waves we've been running. So like what you notice is also here, and we have here Huber robust expectations. So like it's not driven by extreme outliers. The left y-axis, you have the expected the mean expected inflation rate. On the right axis, just a measure of dispersion. The first thing you see is like, the mean and dispersion typically move in locksteps, in the sense that if expectations go up in the mean, they also tend to go up or increase in the dispersion. But then you see, like, before the pandemic, in general, somewhat of an upward bias, but they have been slowly coming down during 2019. Then in 2020, with our first survey wave after the COVID-19 outbreak in early April of 2020, you see this big spike in inflation expectations going up by 2 percentage points, from 3 to 5%, slightly decreasing again, but then actually increasing to more than 6% in early 2021. And by now, actually, if we had continued this plot with the more recent data, actually average inflation expectations are above 8% in our survey. So here, you see indeed, like at the onset of the pandemic, the sharp increase in in inflation expectations at the household level. And so this is just a first graphical piece of evidence that again is consistent with the idea that people that have high realized inflation in their bundle also expect higher inflation going forward. So here what we are plotting on the x-axis, this is this measure of realized inflation in terms of a bin scatter plot. And then on the y-axis, we look at the average expected overall inflation rate going forward. And you see here, like, there's this tight link between what households experience in the non-durable consumption bundle. And I should have mentioned it earlier, like, Nielsen estimates that for the average household, it's about 20 to 25% of the overall consumption spending. Nevertheless, heterogeneity in that part of households bundles and the inflation, realized inflation, indeed seems to matter even for overall US CPI inflation expectations. But of course, like, it's not the tightest link we could think of, because, we do not observe all the consumption bundle of households, but also, like, other salient price changes that are certainly very important for households, such as the price of gas and things like that. That's why we also elicited individuals' perceived inflation rates. So here we just asked them, what do you think was inflation over the last 12 months? And so here, similar to what we saw for inflation expectations, similar structure, mean expectations on the left-hand side, dispersion on the right-hand side. Again, tight co-movement, slowly coming down before the pandemic, then spiking up. And then actually going up to 5% in early 2021. So like indeed there's this, at least on average in terms of dispersion, this mirroring of perceived and expected inflation over time. And so like if we then actually would look at the association of those two, and here again we do that through the lens of a bin scatter plot, where we have perceived inflation on the x-axis and expected inflation on the y-axis, in black before the pandemic up to Q1 of 2020, in red starting with Q2 of 2020, also of 2020. We do see that both before but also during the pandemic, households that perceive inflation to be high also expect inflation high going forward. And this link hasn't really changed at all during COVID-19. The only thing we notice is that during COVID-19, actually, there's more dispersion relative to before, and a small set of households also, perceiving that inflation was really low and also expecting somewhat muted inflation going forward. And now actually we want to also understand, like, going back to our initial motivation, how people then interpreted, the nature of the shock, because oftentimes, if you also think about yourself, of course, we don't form expectations about one variable in isolation. Instead, we might observe a shock and then actually jointly update our outlook for inflation, but potentially also, the unemployment rate, overall GDP growth, our own personal income. And what people have noticed in normal times is that households oftentimes have what we label here as supply side view of the economy, or what some people also have noted labeled like stuck in the 70s. Like they tend to perceive high expected inflation going hand in hand with high unemployment expectations, which is potentially consistent with like a inflationary view of the world, or like high unemployment and high inflation. So like what we now want to understand, whether this view is actually very similar during the pandemic, or whether the heterogeneity in dispersion and inflation expectations instead is more consistent, that people actually differed in the size of in the nature of the shock they kind of perceive. So like what we now want to understand, is it the case that households that expect high inflation going forward, are those also the households that expect high unemployment rates? Or is it that differences in some people thinking that it was a supply shock, others a demand shock, that ultimately helps us understand the dispersion in inflation expectations? And of course, now before we now link the two, here this is now just at the individual household level over time on average. What do you think is the unemployment rate for the overall US economy going forward over the next 12 months? Structure of the figure as before, average expectations in the left y-axis, dispersion in expectation on the right y-axis. So similar to what we saw for inflation expectations, also for unemployment expectations. First of all, like dispersion and mean unemployment expectations tend to move closely together. Then we see like unemployment expectations slowly coming down before the pandemic, but then this sharp increase at the onset of COVID-19, and then however slowly decreasing again. And so now this is now our first graphical type of inspection of how people perceived like the nature of the shock. So here again, similar to one of the previous plots, in black we have like the period before COVID-19, and in red the period during the pandemic for which we have data. And so here what we've noticed is like those that expect high unemployment rates also tends to be those households that on average expect higher inflation going forward, and versus those households that actually perceive that expect low unemployment rate also have low inflation expectations. And this is of course very different from what many economists, professional forecasters or let's say the central bank, the Fed in the US actually was noticing or was arguing in 2020 in terms of like, what we should expect going forward. As I alluded to at the beginning, the Service of Economic Projections from the Federal Reserve Board was actually alluding to or expecting an average inflation rate in 2021 of 1.6% versus households on average actually expected substantially higher inflation. Now, of course, like here, this is just purely a scatter plot, like that's far from any causal statement. So therefore, like what we also want to do a little bit is to get a little bit closer to potentially, having more causal interpretation of the data, is to now say, let's actually compare, because like the nice feature of these surveys is that we have this panel structure. We can then compare at the individual level the update of the inflation expectations from before the pandemic till to the pandemic of the inflation expectations, but also about the unemployment expectations. And then we can now link the two and see like whether those that update upwards the unemployment expectations are also those households that update upwards the inflation expectations. Like this is what we are doing here. So here we have now the revision over time from before to during the pandemic in individuals' unemployment expectations over the next 12 months. And then like from again before to during the pandemic, so like from January of 2020 till April of 2020, how do people update their inflation expectations? The first thing to notice is like, most update upwards the unemployment and the inflation expectations, like pretty much all the numbers or the revisions are positive. But then there's also this very tight link here that, people that update upwards their unemployment expectations also tend to be the ones that update upwards their inflation expectations. So like, again, more consistent with the supply side view of the shock that people had a negative outlook in terms of what happens to the unemployment rate, but also like expecting higher inflation going forward. And so like, I wanted to, those were the couple of things I wanted to share with you. And then, I have a little bit of time now. We can maybe, discuss in more detail some of the things you might actually wonder and ask questions, and we can have a discussion about that. But so like, just to wrap up before we can actually enter the discussion, like, in March of 2020, across the globe, we saw plummeting real activity, but we also saw a large increase in households' inflation expectations on average, but also in terms of a big disagreement across households. And we argue in this paper that a big driver of the disagreement is because people experience different price changes in their realized inflation rate at the onset of the pandemic. And likely driver of this increase in dispersion comes from differences in consumption bundle across households rather than differences in prices paid. And, it looks like households tend to have a very pervasive supply side view of the economy, in the sense that both in normal times, but also during the pandemic, they tend to associate higher inflation expectations with higher unemployment expectations.
Thank you, Professor Weber. That was very interesting. I'm just going to make a few observations, basically from my Indian experience. It's not that necessarily a comment on your paper, but if you have any reaction or you can comment on the things I point out about India, that would be maybe helpful for us.
Yeah,
so
no, totally.
Let me just start first. Of course, I should say that, we wrote EGROW. We had a number of papers in the Q2 of 2020, which, to my knowledge, were the first, working papers we had, which analyzed that this was a unique shock, which is going to have both demand and supply side effects. A lot of people in the beginning of the shock were comparing it to the financial shock, and we were, I think we were the first on record to say that don't make that mistake. It is not just a demand shock, but it will have both supply and demand effects, and where the balance comes out is not clear in the first shock. But then, of course, we did several successive papers, and one of those was Of course, we had a very extensive lockdown. So there the supply effects were very clear, and people in India surprisingly kept thinking of applying that financial model and thinking of the demand side. And what we showed in our first paper was that because of the lockdown and the nature of the lockdown, roughly 50% of the Indian economy was shut down for between 2 and 3 months. And we identified what the effect of that would be. We identified the sectors, we made measurements of the GDP effect and of the employment effect, and went into the sectoral details. And one of the words we coined at that time was this contact services. So we basically had a threefold division in this economy because of the nature of the lockdown. But the more interesting thing was that in a subsequent paper, we defined how the transition would occur. And this was around July of 2020. And there we identified that there would be imbalances, supply-demand imbalances across geographies and products, which is exactly what happened in India and in the US particularly. It was very exaggerated, where you basically, and this we saw in August. This I had not predicted and we didn't have it in India. But what we saw in the US was this shift of demand from durable goods, from services to durable goods, which exaggerated the supply-demand imbalance in the US. But we recognized it very early. The first thing we saw was the pile-up of logistics in Chicago, in Midwest, where the excess demand manifested itself because a lot of imports from outside of consumer goods, and how that's messed up the logistics chain from the Midwest ports. Anyway, so the interesting thing is, conclusion from that was, again, we saw it as a one-time transition, but of course, then we had the second wave. So the one-time was we said would be temporary. Yeah. And it would have been, in my view, I still think that if we didn't have a second wave. So in India, we also had a second wave starting in 21, and that in a way extended the transition. So you had a kind of one transition, and before it was kind of completely over, you get another shock and another transition. So this temporary, which we had defined both for, in fact, I'm on this, we are invited to present to the RBI governor every time before the MPC meeting. And at that meeting, I had pointed this out. And our central bank, in effect, then did the analysis for other countries, etc. Of course, I had based mine on India only. And so what we saw, this prediction of temporary, but of course, the temporary stretched out. But that was basically, that structure was adopted by our central bank and as used repeatedly to say that many of these effects were temporary. And in Indian case, of course, we did see it temporary, but in the US case, because of the disruption of the complete logistics structure, it has turned out to be much more permanent, and the China effect, etc. You know that better than we do. But I think that's been an important factor. The main comment I would make, and here I think it's related to your paper, I think you provided a very good explanation and food for thought for us, that one of the things we had been noticing was this huge gap between the RBI household consumers survey expectations and what one has been seeing in reality on the ground. And we've often wondered. So I was not familiar with, and I think many others aren't, about the research in the US. So it's been very useful to hear from you the formal explanation of why that happens, why you get the dispersion, etc. But here I would mention just two things, and maybe you can comment on that. One of the things we have noticed is that, frequent use items. In India, it happens to be not milk, but vegetables, which people buy kind of every day. They buy fresh vegetables. The vendor comes to your house, or you go to the market and you buy fresh vegetables. And the second is the volatility. We have certain vegetables and which have these seasonal weather-related spikes, and then seasonal spikes. Milk actually comes into the season, in summer milk becomes more expensive. So this volatility, and you helped us make a little more sense of it. One always thought. So clearly that influences the household expectation. The volatile, uncertain price, the seasonally varying prices seem to have a much larger effect. Of course, the detailed research, I think somebody should take this and take your framework and do it specifically for India. It would be useful if, Charan, if we can perhaps get somebody to do work on that. Well, let me end with that. If you have any reaction, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll open it up to questions and comments from others.
I think actually this was super interesting that you just mentioned, that it's vegetables in India. So like I know that there's some research in France. It is the price of baguette and bread more generally. So like it's indeed like, I think like, grocery items and the things that households purchase frequently tend to be really important. And so something I actually didn't allude to during the talk today, but in this paper in the JPE last May, what we actually show in detail is also that it looks at people actually put a higher weight on price increases relative to price cuts, which then paired with the volatility actually can deliver this persistent upward bias in households' inflation expectations. So I definitely do think like, even like a seasonal price increase then actually can have a somewhat, a non-seasonal increase in inflation expectations, because people notice when things go up, they pay less attention to the price decreases, it looks like. And so like, I think that would be quite interesting also to see like whether that's the case in India indeed.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, Charan, you want to ask questions, or some of your colleagues who want to start off the questions?
Sure. I just had a very basic question, Professor Michael. Now, we looked through your presentation and that looks very good. But then when there are events like what we are facing right now, and then would you still feel that there's a difference between perception? Or would you think that these are such all-pervading events that expectations synchronize and move between the households and between males and females?
So like at least in January, like this is of course now before we don't have data now yet for like the last 2 weeks. In January, for example, we still saw very similar patterns as what we saw during the presentation. Now, I would still expect that there is still this, because like you tend to see like both the average but also the dispersion moving together hand in hand. So times of high, so like I would expect now inflation expectations went up even more, but those are also the times typically when dispersion across households is the highest. So like there's this tight link. So it's not that if we have now a shock and everyone would update upwards to the same number. Instead, like people do update upwards, but actually even the dispersion goes up in those times. So I think I would expect something very similar, like when we get the new data in a couple of weeks, most likely.
Okay. Sharon, you see any?
I had one more supplement question, Professor. Traditionally, as you know, that monetary policy and the fiscal policy played a very prominent role in expectation formation. But from your research, which is very practical oriented, and I would tend to agree with that, in that research framework, where would you place the implications of the monetary and the fiscal policy?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So like we've actually been trying to understand like how fiscal policy and monetary policy does affect household expectations. Like, at least for households in the US, where, until the onset of the pandemic and realized inflation was low and stable, most people, I guess, were rationally inattentive. There was a huge degree of kind of lack of knowledge about basic pillars of policy making. So if you would ask people that we did that in 2018, what do you think is the inflation rate the Federal Reserve tries to achieve over longer periods of time, to get an idea whether they know what the inflation target is? We saw that 40% of our survey participants thought that the inflation target is higher than 10%. So like, people tend not to follow actively what central banks do. And, if they do, oftentimes they don't directly understand the implications. Nevertheless, what we then show is like, if central banks were able to directly, communicate to households, and, we do that via information provision experiments in the survey. So like, we randomly split our sample. Some people, get a summary statistic of inflation, others read a statement about inflation, others actually get a press coverage of the recent FOMC meeting. Then we study within like the survey how people update, but also after 3 and 6 months. And so what we find is that people react quite strongly to information we provide, but then crucially also subsequently do adjust their consumption patterns. Like, I think the big disconnect is that most of the time people don't pay attention to, let's say in the US, what the Fed is doing, but to the extent the Fed is actually was able to pierce the veil of ignorance, they could actually quite strongly manage the expectations of households.
Thank you. Actually, I have a follow-up questions, kind of similar, but not exactly. I have often wondered again, one can understand that the expectations of financial markets, the experts who deal with bonds, equities, etc., has an important effect on the economy. I'm now not convinced that household expectations really matter. So what would be your professional comment on that? I mean, what do you think?
No, that's a quite common. Certainly, like, why do we care if they wouldn't matter? So like what we show in this paper I just alluded to, this Montana policy communication paper, we show that people causally, so like there's a causal link between inflation expectations and household spending. So like we can show in actually the scanner data, those that have higher inflation expectations because of our treatments go out and consume more. So like there's indeed an effect on their real decision. And something we want to study now is, because like this is a big discussion, of course, and a concern right now, that second round effects and wage price spirals. So we do want to understand now whether indeed higher inflation expectations also affect wage bargaining and labor supply decision of households. We don't have the survey is going in the field next week, so we don't have results there yet. But based on casual observation, I would at least right now, with the inflation expectations spiking up, people seem to actually bargain for higher wages. So like that's, and of course, the second reason also why we would care about households' inflation expectations.
But from the past, you of course said you are planning to investigate, but do we have any evidence from the past that this has actually happened? Or
so there's a little, time series evidence, but not at an individual levels. Like that's, I think, a big gap in the literature.
Right. Yeah, of course, theoretically that, right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So, Charan, we've...
I know we have hit the time, Professor. Would you have a few more minutes?
Other question, quick questions, I can take a few.
Yeah, I also had one more question. Professor, in India, we have generally seen that when the gas prices go up, it's just the first round itself that prices go up. In America, it's more direct. In India, we have the subsidies, it's a little indirect. But when the impact happens on the consumer goods, say in terms of food or in terms of production, it is the second and the third round effect. So when inflation expectations that you were trying to capture in your analysis, I thought you were, and I could be wrong in that, but I thought you were not making any distinction between the first round, second round, and third round implications of gas prices. Because when you were comparing the males and the females and what was providing them the inputs, you probably treated them all at par. Would you think that if you had taken the second or the third round impact, it would have a different implication on your computations?
That's actually an interesting question. So we haven't looked at that at all in the US. So like, there's certainly like we should check that out. I wouldn't know on the spot, to be honest. But certainly like that's would certainly be like interesting to see, like on the one hand, whether there's a difference, as you say, like for India in terms of gas versus groceries, but then also whether this would also even transmit, differentially across genders. And maybe for men it's then more on the gas price side, and for women on the grocery side, on average or so. That's certainly something to look at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, again, if you don't have the information, that's fine. But last question. Pursuing that wage bargaining thing, the obvious question which arises is where there is bargaining, right? Where there is some power with the, for example, it could be highly qualified people, educated people, where probably they have some power to bargain or something. Can you, I mean, if you have some information, can you give us some idea of, at least from the US, where I mean, how to think about it or how you think about it?
Yes, like in general, I would agree that, before the pandemic, it's certainly like, the more, educated, higher income people that had more of some extent of bargaining power, tech people, let's say. But actually right now, it's exactly the opposite. Like the labor market is the tightest, like at the bottom of the income distribution. So service sector, like that's where you see that, lots of people retired early. The labor force participation is substantially lower in that part of the distribution, and so like that's actually right now where you indeed see, like, McDonald's starts paying, like, hiring premium to someone that sticks around for 3 months. You get an additional $1,000 because it's so hard to find workers in that segment.
Yeah. Right. That is, I guess, the pandemic effect. Yes, of course, the pandemic has kind of changed things and disturbed the supply-demand imbalances. Yes, very a good point. Right. Right. So that's another way to kind of think about the pandemic and some of its implications. Right. I'm trying to generalize and apply it to India. Yeah. Thank you. That's very good. So if Charan, unless we have any other, I see a few professors, but they've not asked any questions. So I don't know.
Well,
do we have any professor who's listening and wants to ask a question?
Dr. Michael, I just have one thing to ask. Am I audible?
Good.
I was just wondering that I have worked in pensions. So the average Indian income is 15,000 as per the annual wage survey of Labor Department. So, and with the lessening of income, they become very myopic regarding their future savings.
Yeah.
So what type of these things, what acts in US do not act actually in India? So what type of solutions are available for India? Because workers are guided by money wages. The Keynesian theory still haunts us. Here in India, the Keynesian theory haunts us. Workers are basically guided by money wages. They sacrifice their social security and they go for whatever money in hand. So if you say, I reduce your provident fund by then and increase your money wage, they are happy with that. They do not go by their real wage. They do not consider their real wage at all. So that's
actually
what holds true in India.
No, that's actually
Thank
interesting.
you,
I was not
Mr.
aware of
Sanyal.
that.
Let's Professor answer.
Yes, like I was not aware of that that this is the case in India. So, like, one way to think about it, if everyone is like, was a hand to mouth person, that's how I would model it. Then, there you would get that there's very little intertemporal substitution in such a setting, and then of course inflation expectations wouldn't matter, and instead, like, every dollar that you kind of hand out would immediately be consumed. And so, like, that would be a setting where you have a very high marginal propensity to consume. Fiscal rebates would be super effective, but inflation expectations wouldn't matter, of course. No, I'm totally with you. Like, if that's the case, then we have to think then how central bank policy that tries to bring down inflation wouldn't then be super effective in such a setting.
So you are asking me to model like MPC is close to 1, and the difference between BT and BT minus 1, that is, if you model it by BT minus BT minus 1, BT minus 2, then how are you thinking of the modeling? Can you just give me a hint regarding that in case of India?
When you say BT, what do you refer to as BT?
N is equal to 1 running from BT, T minus I runs from 1 to N, adaptive expectation in that case.
Mr. Sanyal, maybe you can get the email from Dr. Charan Singh and send him an email. I'm sure Professor will be happy to answer your question. But I have to end the seminar. So thank you, Professor. That's been very interesting and a good discussion. With that, Charan, you want to conclude the session?
Professor Michael, I want to request you and reiterate what our chairman said. You have presented an excellent research, and we at EGROW would like to partner with you. And if you would permit, we would replicate that for India. We'll attempt to replicate that for India, provided you are one of the co-authors with one of our experts. That is one thing. Secondly, I want to also reiterate our offer to your PhD student. The type of quality research that you are doing, I'm sure your PhD student, if he wants to pursue and survey-based research in India, will be happy to host your PhD student here. I want to thank you for accepting our request to make this presentation to our audience in India, and I think it's a very relevant topic as our chairman observed, and also chairman gave you his observations. I want to make two important announcements. Housekeeping. Next Wednesday, which is March 16, and we would invite Professor Michael to be here too. We are organizing a talk by 2 army journals, 2 ambassadors, and 2 economists on Russia, Ukraine, and the Indian economy. So it'll be a 90-minute session. Everybody gives first opening remarks for 10 minutes with a 30-minute interaction. So we'll have 6 experts with us. That is on Wednesday, March 16. On March 18, we have another talk from Lekha Chakravarti, who is the professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and she is going to be speaking from at a little different time frame. She is speaking from 4 to 5 p.m. and the topic she's speaking is macroeconomic policy responses to COVID-19 pandemic. So, and I'm sure because she's a fiscal expert, she's going to be covering the fiscal area. So 2 important seminars are coming up during this week through EGROW. One is on Wednesday, March 16, and the other is on March 18, Friday, our traditional time slot. With this, I would like to mention that Professor Michael's presentation will be available on our website tomorrow by noon. You're welcome to use it. I'm also going to be using it again because such an interesting research. And with that, I want to thank each one of you, Professor Michael, our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani, and the participants who have spent time with us and made this discussion so interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for having me and for the great question. It was lots of fun and looking forward to interacting in the future. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Bye.